Okay, great. Well, thanks, Diana. And hello, everybody. Good morning. Buenos dias. And thank you so much for joining me. And thank you to ITEN Riyadh and the OAS for inviting me to talk. So my talk today is on teacher professional development across the globe and who's really excelling at this and who's doing well and who's giving it their best and what messages we can take away from this. So I'm going to start with three caveats. And first is that good teacher professional development is a means to an end and not an end itself. And the end is teacher quality, as we all know. And professional development really is part of this much broader system, excuse me, of teacher quality. So you'll see in this presentation that I'm going to veer into issues of recruitment and selection and pre-service and support. And then next, I've actually tried to limit my presentations to places I know well, either because I've worked there or I've done intensive desk research combined with interviews. That's my criteria. If I haven't worked in the country, I've done research and I've actually done a lot of interviews with people in country. And I'll share where my experience lies and where it doesn't lie. And then finally, because I've limited my examination to places I've worked in, I'm really leaving out a lot of places that have done very well in terms of teacher education, like Cuba. And I'm ignoring countries that are becoming education stars, like Estonia, simply because I haven't been there, except as a tourist. So you can see this is sort of around the globe. It's kind of a geographic sample. I'm categorizing countries based on efforts, and I'm drawing some very broad conclusions about what can we learn from these countries. So I'll go ahead and get started. I think I've mentioned where I've gotten my information from. Excuse me, my own work, my own study visits, interviews, and then some direct work that I've done. So I don't mention every country that's on this list, but I mention most of them. So I'll go ahead and get started with the term striver, because I want to make sure that it's understood that to me, a striver is a really complimentary term. I think these are countries that are really working hard to improve teacher quality in general, in terms of selection and initial preparation and retention, supervision, professional development. And I would actually say that so many countries in Latin America are in this category. So Argentina, Brazil. I just returned this morning from Honduras. I finally fell asleep at 3:30 a.m. after a 1:30 a.m. flight. And, I spent the last week in Honduras talking to people who are also working to improve the teacher professional development system in Honduras. So this is, by no means an effort unique to the people that I single out here. There's so many countries in the world now that are focused on improving the quality of teaching and improving teacher professional development. And I will focus on two countries where I've been involved in some of these efforts in some way. So the first is the Republic of Georgia. So I'll ask you to get out your map. You'll see that Georgia is not the US state. It's actually the small Caucasus country between Russia and Turkey and along the Black Sea. It's actually a gorgeous place. And we may be joined by some people from the Teacher Professional Development Center at the Ministry of Education in Georgia. So here's a larger view of Georgia. Excuse me. So Georgia, like a number of former Soviet countries, had a very strong education system, especially in math and science teaching. And this kind of, I don't want to say fell apart, but it diminished a lot after the collapse and Georgia's independence from the former Soviet Union in 1991. So Georgia's really set about over the last 10 or 11 years to reform and rebuild its education system, particularly teaching. So it's been using PISA data to design policy. As you see here from this slide, the Ministry of Education and Sciences has a whole department devoted to teacher professional development called the Teacher Professional Development Center. And over the last 10 years, Georgia's really increased requirements to be a teacher. It's introduced much more holistic management approaches of the teaching profession. It's introduced a much more comprehensive approach to the evaluation of teachers. It's linked professional development to teacher pay and promotion. And relative to other sectors in Georgia, teaching pay is quite low, as it probably is in many of the places you're coming from. But in 2015, the government of Georgia introduced a much more comprehensive regulation policy focused on 5 areas, which you can see here at the bottom of the screen. And the first was improving higher education programs for teachers, so the quality of pre-service education that they receive, diversifying ways for entering the profession, ensuring quality control, improving the system for teacher professional development and linking it to teacher activities, developing effective systems for teacher evaluation connected with career advancement and remuneration, and finally, delegating responsibility to schools and involving them in the professional development and the evaluation of teachers. So Georgia now has 4 levels for teachers. This slide was shared with me by the Teacher Professional Development Center. And you can see here, you can't see here, but advancement is based on not only a number of years teaching, but also on the kinds of activities, many of which are professional development related, in which teachers participate. And these are all, so you can move through this scale of being a teacher from a practitioner to a mentor teacher by participating in professional development. Georgia has a nationwide professional development project called the Training Educators for Excellence activity. It's actually funded by the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and it's carried out by IREX, which is a small Washington, D.C. NGO. And as you can see here, it provides professional development for 14,000 Georgian public middle school, high school teachers, 2,000 public school principals, and 2,000 school-based professional development coordinators, so 1 per school. And the professional development is really diversified. So it's workshops, it's online learning, it's study groups, it's teacher meetups, learning circles. So what's the lesson that Georgia holds for us in this webinar? And I would say that as we see in Georgia and a lot of places, we really have to incentivize teaching. Georgians are trying to make it prestigious, they're trying to make it pay, they're building in room for professional growth and salary increases, and then they're embedding professional development within this system. And I think Georgia is really trying to increase teaching supply quantity in order to increase quality, because you need enough people. First, you need enough teachers, and then you need to get from that pool, you have to figure out who the best people are. And I think that's what the Georgians are trying to do. And hopefully we'll be joined by some who can share later. So it's really incentivizing, Georgia's really incentivizing continuous improvement. It's providing opportunities for growth and advancement and increased responsibility and promotion and pay. Is it doing this really well? This is something that Georgian folks can answer. But I would just say from my perspective, where in so many parts of the world, teacher quality and teacher professional development issues are left let's see, what's the word I'm looking for? When people oftentimes ignore them because they're so big and they don't want to deal with the unions. Georgia is really admirable in its efforts to really improve the whole teacher quality system. So I'll move on. And my second striver is Ecuador. And Ecuador, too, is very similar to Georgia in many respects, but it's much farther along in the process. And I actually know the Ecuador model much better because I was actually involved in it for several months. So Ecuador's results have produced impressive results in both education quantity and quality. So on the TERCE, which is Latin America's regional test of 6th graders, between 2006 and 2013, Ecuador made the largest gains in reading scores among the 15 countries tested. And so there's been lots of reform of teacher quality and teacher professional development at the policy level since around 2009. And actually, the former president, Rafael Correa, really made education a national priority and part of his whole Revolución Ciudadana. So in 2009, Ecuador changed how it did teacher hiring based on competency tests and standards, and promotion based on performance evaluations versus years of service. And it introduced the possibility of dismissing poor quality teachers after 2 bad performance reviews. 2011, it introduced a much more broader and powerful education law, which really restricted, or some people would say eliminated, the power of teacher unions. It raised teacher quality through policies to attract and retain and motivate the very best possible candidates. It stimulated and supported schools to become the main engines of quality improvement, similar to Georgia. And it created a marketing campaign called Quiero Ser Maestro to really attract young people to become teachers. So the teacher, I want to focus on two things here, and one is the teacher recruitment and the other is teacher professional development in Ecuador. And so teacher recruitment became very, very, very rigorous, a much more selective entry process into pre-service teacher education and much higher quality pre-service training. Again, I mentioned these individual performance evaluations at regular intervals, which is something that hadn't happened in Ecuador before. And the country introduced a much high-quality system of professional development programs for in-service teachers. And so this is what I'd like to focus on. I should also mention that Ecuador also increased teacher pay. It actually doubled teachers' pay within a year. And it's established a merit-based career path similar to Georgia with promotions based on teacher performance and evaluations. And it really narrowed the range between the highest and the lowest teacher salaries. So a very big part of Ecuador's emphasis was focused on this quality of the education that teachers receive. So the government closed 23 low-quality pedagogical institutes. It established a minimum score for entry into the teacher training institutions. It jacked up the score really fast over 1 year. And it created, what I'll focus on here was the government created Universidad Nacional de Educación, which began in 2015. And I was in Ecuador for several months as part of a team that was actually planning this National Teacher University. So the idea was that UNAI, as it's called, would be like the National Institute of Education in Singapore, about which I'll talk in a little while. It would be a one-stop shop of teacher training for everyone who taught from pre-kindergarten all the way to graduate school. It would be a university that focused on actually international best practices around teaching, and everyone would go through this system. So there have been a lot of positives in terms of Ecuador's whole approach toward improving teacher quality. The teacher evaluation system has been strengthened. The government has strengthened economic incentives for good performers. It strengthened its in-service program, which was called CIPROFE. It required all teachers to take at least one professional development course during their career, during a year, and it really tried to centralize and standardize professional development and pre-service and in-service teacher education through this new university, UNAI, which is now actually up and running. Because I know Ecuador so well, there's a lot of negatives to this approach. The government raised standards too high, too fast. And so actually in 2014, it was faced with a depleted teaching rank in the single digits. Only a few people passed this new national examination. And instead of UNAI really focusing on teaching, I'd like to give the floor to someone from UNAI who could defend this. But from my point of view, it was really no different from any other university because, in fact, it required that every instructor have a PhD and that every instructor do research. And as we all know, when university faculty have to focus on research versus teaching, most times research wins. There was really no preparation for the people who would be teaching the teachers. And these are folks with PhDs who come from universities, and as we know, that's kind of the last frontier in good teaching. Those folks just have never had preparation, a lot of them, on how to teach well. Unfortunately, UNAI kind of burned a lot of bridges because the government closed a lot of the pedagogical institutes that weren't doing well, but it also said to the ones that were doing well, like, sorry, your people aren't going through your institutions anymore. There are a number of really excellent universities in Ecuador that were kind of sidelined or felt sidelined by UNAI. And last but not least, I think Korea kind of blasted through and didn't get a lot of teacher buy-in because he really cracked down on unions. And unfortunately, Ecuador's economy's gone down since 2014. So a lot of these initiatives, some of them have stalled. But nonetheless, Ecuador has made tremendous gains across, in and of itself in terms of improving teacher quality and teacher professional development. So these are our strivers. And before I move on to our stars, let me stop here for a second and see if anybody has any questions or comments, and I'll take a look at the chat. And please feel free to add to anything that I've said. My mouse isn't working very well here, so I'm trying to go through the chat, see if there's anything. Good morning, good morning. Questions, anyone? Anything you'd like to ask or you'd like to have me clarify? I know we'll have a session at the end, and we'll have some time at the end. Actually, I realized I forgot to say one thing about Ecuador, and that's in terms of lessons. And so what's our lesson from Ecuador? And I think our lesson from Ecuador is really that if you want to improve the system of teaching quality and teacher professional development, you really have to improve every part of the system. The people who teach teachers, school leaders, teachers themselves. And part of that lesson is it ain't cheap. Ecuador invested a lot of money in improving its teacher education system. And I think Ecuador is an example of, if you want to do this, you actually do have to spend the resources on it. So I'm not seeing any questions, so I will go ahead and move on and talk a little bit about stars. And so I'm focused here on the city of Boston. There's obviously more than one star across the globe, but for the sake of time, I really wanted to focus on our superstars. So I decided to cut down here on stars, and that is actually the city of Boston. So we've looked at kind of classic in-service upgrading professional development, as in Georgia, supported by internal and external partners. And we've looked at kind of a centralized one-stop shop for teacher education like Unai in Ecuador. And this is really a third way. What I'll share here is Boston's third way of in-service and also pre-service that combines elements of traditional and alternative teacher preparation programs. And these are urban teacher residencies. So if you're not familiar with Boston Public Schools, and I live in Boston, I'm in Boston right now, for decades, Boston Public Schools were synonymous with inequality, dysfunction, a lack of quality, with busing, with racial animosity, with flight of students out of the city to the suburbs, and with teacher unions that were seen as obstacles to reform. So I'd just like to share a vignette from my childhood, which was that I went to Catholic schools. My parents were Irish immigrants and they were afraid of public schools. But when I was bad, when I was naughty, my parents would threaten to take me out of my Catholic school and put me in Boston Public Schools. And whatever I was doing, I changed my behavior because they were just such horrible places. But in the last 20 years, Boston has really transformed student achievement and teaching quality. And on the national assessment, this is just to show you where Boston is in Massachusetts. So on the National Assessment of Education Progress, which is also known as the United States' National Report Card, Boston Public School performance is on a par with the national average for public schools across the United States, including suburban schools in grade 4 reading and grade 8 mathematics. This is the only urban school district in the country to have this distinction. And since 2007, the percentage of ninth graders who have dropped out of school has decreased in 2015 to its lowest point ever in the school district's history. So Boston has really institutionalized and instituted a number of really innovative and sometimes controversial approaches. So it's introduced multiple pathways to becoming a teacher. So for example, high school students who want to teach are identified, they're mentored, they're supported through university. And there's a number of initiatives that Boston has started. But what I really wanted to focus here on is the Boston Teacher Residency Program. So this began in 2003. It's a medical model of pre- and in-service professional development for new teachers. It's practice-based and it's clinical. So Boston teacher resident candidates, they're university graduates, and they commit to teach in Boston public schools for at least 3 years after their residency year, which I'll explain in a minute. And those who leave have to actually repay the program. But those who stay, for the most part, are placed within Boston Public Schools. So it's really a commitment by both sides to one another. So it's an intensive 2-month summer workshop. And then it gives these teachers' initial skills and knowledge about teaching. But then these teacher candidates go into a residency program for a year in a Boston teaching academy. So they're assigned to a department, to a grade, to a team, and they learn how to teach in a very collaborative, mentoring environment under the very close supervision and guidance of experienced educators. So they teach 4 full days a week, from Monday to Thursday, and then on Fridays and one night a week, they actually take graduate school courses at a partner university, which is the University of Massachusetts, and they get a stipend for the year. So their preparation is if you think of a triangle, it's they're getting the theory and the research and the knowledge about teaching. They're getting mentoring and support, another leg of the triangle, and then they're in class actually learning about teaching through direct experiences with students. So after their residency year, Boston teacher graduates are eligible to be hired within the district. Now, not everyone is hired, but most people are. They're at the front of the queue. So a BTR, a Boston Teacher Residency candidate, will be ahead of someone who comes from outside the district and applies for the same job. So they're given preference. So if they pass their year, their residency year, they can then be hired as a teacher of record, and they have full classroom responsibilities. But then they have a 1-year induction program. They participate in this for all novice teachers, and then 2 to 3 years of more support and more mentoring. So what are the results of this program? BTR graduates are much more racially diverse than other Boston Public School novice teachers. And this is important because Boston Public Schools, like many U.S. school districts, is a majority-minority district. Most students are non-white. They are more likely to teach math and science, which are professions or subject areas where there's traditionally teacher shortages. They're much more likely to remain in teaching in the district through year 5. And as we know, the first 5 years of a teacher's career are crucial. And by year 5, typically 50% of new teachers have actually left the profession. So these folks are staying. And the effectiveness of the BTR graduates in math improves over time. By their 4th or 5th year, they actually outperform veteran teachers in student scores in math and English. What's really extraordinary to me is that BTR graduates are 4 times more likely than Massachusetts teachers to be rated exemplary in their 4th year of teaching. And Massachusetts has the best education system in the United States. And if we took Massachusetts out of the United States, it would have one of the best education systems in the world. So we're talking about folks who become really, really excellent teachers in and of themselves. So what's our lesson from Boston? And I think the third lesson here is it's really important to match professional development to the needs of students and districts. So a famous Boston politician once said that all politics is local, and BTR is the Boston Teacher Residency Program, is making all professional development local. This is not a program to prepare teachers to teach in another city like New York. This is a program that prepares people to teach in Boston, to deal with situations in Boston. And the admission staff screens candidates considering the school district's needs and candidate quality. So Boston, like Ecuador and Singapore, which I'll discuss in a moment, really controls its supply and demand of teachers through one centralized pre- and in-service mechanism. And BTR really demands commitment from candidates, but it also commits to them. As I said, over 90% are actually placed in Boston Public Schools. So finally, let's pause here for a sec to see if folks have any questions. I need my glasses to read the chat. Questions from anybody so far? Not seeing anything, so I'll I'll go ahead and move on, and hopefully what we can do is have some time at the end to chat. So finally, let's turn to our superstars, and these are Shanghai, Japan, and Singapore. And I'll simply say that if you're really interested in learning more about East Asian systems, a terrific resource is NCEE, which I think stands for the National Center for Education and the Economy. But anyway, it's headed by Mark Tucker. So if you look up NCEE plus Mark Tucker, you'll find much better information about East Asian systems than I'm giving you here. They really have invested a lot of time and travel into East Asia to really learn from what those systems are doing well. So I'll start with Shanghai as our first superstar. And many education researchers really argue that Shanghai has the best teacher professional development system in the world. So this is the city of Shanghai. This is Shanghai on a map. It's China's richest city. It may be China's biggest city. And what's unique about Shanghai, in addition to its wealth, is that, as you know, China is an extremely centralized system, and the Ministry of Education is no different. But since the 1980s, Shanghai has been designated as a special education innovation zone. So it's had a lot of freedom from the central Chinese government to innovate. So this is why we hear about Shanghai and we don't hear about the rest of China or other parts of China, because Shanghai is really kind of a unique place. Shanghai places a huge premium on teacher quality, which means teacher evaluation, which means teachers are constantly working to improve their practice, which means that their teacher professional development system has to be excellent. So Shanghai schools require teachers to undergo continuous professional development throughout their careers. So new teachers will get about 120 hours of professional development in their first year of teaching, and then 360 hours every 5 years, plus an optional 180 government-funded hours. So new teachers who are teaching from year 0 to 5, can have about 540 hours of professional development a year. And that depends on every 5 years. So that's about, if you just do the simple math in 10-hour days, that's about 54 days of professional development, and that's kind of a minimum. And new teachers in Shanghai, like the Boston Teacher Residency program, also have a mentor for 3 years. So teachers who enter the Chinese system, the Shanghai system, actually have much, much stronger content knowledge than they do in the United States, even at the elementary level. So new senior level teachers are also required to spend at least 540 hours on professional development every 5 years. So this is roughly about 20 days a year. So most professional development is job embedded and it's very collaborative. So there's two kinds of sort of cornerstones of professional development in Shanghai, and one is peer observations. There's a lot of peer observation. So new teachers will observe mentees, will observe mentors, peers will observe peers. This is actually a constant. And there's a lot of collaborative planning time. So teachers often meet regularly, often weekly in groups. They do research. They're in their subject areas. They're discussing best practices. They're sharing advice. They're creating common lesson plans. It's very similar. In fact, it's kind of like lesson study. And these meetings can last hours, and they oftentimes will involve outside experts, and they're constantly ongoing. So professional development in Shanghai is highly collaborative. It's also highly public. I've mentioned the peer observations, but Shanghai has this concept of open classrooms where people come in and observe teachers teaching. So it has open classrooms, it has peer observations. Principals in Shanghai are trained as instructional leaders, and they're supposed to supervise and guide teachers. And they do very frequent classroom observations on the order of 30 to 60 classes a semester, and they give extensive teacher feedback. And professional development in Shanghai is very competitive. So there are school and district and citywide teaching competitions and lesson competitions where teachers actually prepare lessons and they showcase it to an audience. So like a lot of other countries like Ireland or Singapore or Finland or even like Ecuador is trying to do, Shanghai does select the top 5% of its graduates from high school to study education. But that doesn't, just because you're the smartest person doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be the best teacher. And I think this is really the lesson from Shanghai, is that in the Shanghai model, great teachers are not born, as we often think. They are made. And so the Shanghai system really takes the long view of teaching. It really is committed to creating great teachers. So it grooms them, it supports them, and it manages them throughout their careers. So throughout the career of a teacher in Shanghai, teachers will be mentored and mentored. They'll observe and be observed, and quite a lot. And as they meet professional development benchmarks and performance benchmarks and professional benchmarks, teachers are able to increase their status and their responsibility and their salary, like the Georgians are trying to do, but they don't necessarily leave teaching. So this increased capacity is kind of cycled back into the professional development system, because these folks who've received the promotions and are moving through the system are actually leading the professional development as master teachers. So there's a built-in promotion and quality assurance mechanism. So I will move on to superstar number 2, and that is Japan. And like, I should mention that I have been to Shanghai, but as a tourist, actually for work, but I have not seen schools in Shanghai, and my information for Shanghai actually comes from, so Boston I taught there, Ecuador I worked there, Georgia I'm working there. Here with Shanghai and also with Japan, I've done extensive desk studies and actually had a lot of interviews with people at the ministry and at universities. Japan I've been to quite frequently, actually, about 8 or 10 times. To me, Japan is just an extraordinarily impressive place in general. So Japan really has one of the top education systems in the world, and it's had it for such a long time. And I would really argue that all of the best practices that we understand now about, especially around teacher collaboration and rigor and good professional development, they come from Japan. The Japanese may not necessarily get credit for it, but they really are the people who were much farther out along than any of us, including people in Shanghai and Singapore. So Japan is it has one of the top education systems in the world, and it's really excellent at providing both its rich and poor students with equal educational opportunities. And I think for 3 reasons. And first of all, in Japan, teaching is a highly respected, prestigious, popular profession. So teacher salaries are higher than the OECD average, and they'd have to be because Japan is extraordinarily expensive. And the teaching profession is very selective, both at the program admission and the hiring phases. So prospective teachers have to take the national entrance examination in order to be considered for admission into an undergraduate teaching program. And then next, what assures, I think, equity is that new teachers are assigned to schools by the prefecture. So a prefecture is like a state or a province. Teachers aren't hired by schools in Japan, they're hired by the prefecture, and then the prefecture distributes them based on need. So early in their career, Japanese teachers move around quite a lot. Every 3 years, they're transferred. So this does 2 things. First of all, it exposes teachers to all kinds of teaching practices in all kinds of places. And secondly, governments make sure that the very best teachers are actually getting into the schools with the poorest kids who need them most. And then third, Japan, unlike a lot of systems, counterintuitively, actually spends its resources on most of its money on the schools with disadvantaged students and less money on schools with advantaged students, which is completely contrary to how we fund schools in the United States. So by international standards, sorry, the map of Japan, by international standards, Japanese teachers participate in quite a lot of professional development. So over 20 days a year for teachers with 10 plus years of experience, to really intensive induction programs for new teachers. So one of the great features of Japan in terms of teacher learning is that young teachers, as I said, learn from different teaching environments. They're exposed to all kinds of different talented peers, and they learn from their methods. But the whole professional development system in Japan is really rigorous. So teachers have to show in every phase of their career that they are up to date on skills and practices in order to renew their certificates, and this happens every 10 years. Japan has a very highly centralized education system with a really highly decentralized professional development system. So you can get professional development from national providers down to local providers, down to taking your own classes, you can do individual training. But Japan's most famous gift to the world of professional development, as I'm sure you all know, is lesson study, which really builds on the highly collaborative culture in Japan, and the Japanese focus on rigor and on research. And lesson study occurs among teachers who really are actually the very, very best, because Japan has such an intensive selection process, which I'll talk about. So in lesson study, teachers with varying levels of experience will just study teaching techniques, they'll formulate lesson plans, then they'll implement the plan. And as you'll see here, people come in and actually study the students. They actually are watching the students as they learn. So lesson study is really ongoing. It can last for months. It's really extensive. It's really, really collaborative. And I think it's very typically Japanese. It's about precision, and it's about detail, and it's about a lot of hard work. The Japanese break down instruction like no other people I've seen on earth. The Japanese have words for things that we do in classrooms that none of us have words for. And I'm sure you know that there's also this kind of art of how to use the chalkboard. So I think the big lesson that Japan has given the world in terms of professional development is that teacher collaboration equals teacher quality. So Japan, like most Asian cultures, is very group-based. The Japanese teaching is very highly collaborative. Teachers share a share a teaching room, and every school day is organized around time for teachers to collaborate. But I also think that Japan has a second lesson for us, and it's been so good for so long because it is so rigorous and selective, and there's all kinds of filters built into the Japanese teaching pipeline to make sure that only the very best emerge. So there's an exam to get into university, as I mentioned, and then teaching in Japan is very selective. There's typically 4 candidates for every 1 position, so much less than 50% of licensed teachers will actually be selected to teach. When you apply for a job in Japan, graduates of initial teacher education programs are hired by the prefecture. And so they have to go through a days-long series of employment examinations that test their knowledge in all kinds of content areas, but then has them do things like demonstrate, micro-teach, prepare lesson plans, interviews, write essays, written examinations, produce research. It's extraordinarily rigorous, and these people are already qualified as teachers. And then teachers are then ranked from top to bottom. There's no passing score. And the prefecture will then choose people based on their highest rank. So you don't just have people that have met the score, you have people who really are at the very, very top of their profession who are chosen to teach. So there's so this kind of selectivity and rigor then continues with examinations. In year 10, you go through a similar process when you want tenure, etc. So let's see, anything in the chat? So I'll move on because I think I'm starting to run out of time a little bit. So I'll move on to our last group, which is Singapore. To simply say our last superstar, which there's just so many great things to say about education in Singapore that it's hard to know where to start. And Singapore is consistently recognized as one of the best as the best education system in the world. And that little red circle that you see on your screen is much larger than Singapore, which is a city-state at the end of the Malay Peninsula. So I'll add a qualifier. My work in Singapore was between 2007 and 2010. Some of what I say may be dated, but I've actually supplemented it for another project I was working on with a lot of desk research and interviews. So professional development in Singapore is extraordinarily high quality. So there are only essentially nine providers, the universities and the National Institute of Education, that can actually provide professional development, or it happens at the schools, but it's very high quality, which means that it is very controlled by the government and by who is designated as a provider of professional development. Not anybody can walk in and do PD in Singapore, unlike, I would say, the United States at times. It's mandatory, so teachers have to take 100 hours of professional development a year. Again, most of it is through the National Institute of Education, which is this one-stop shop for teacher pre-service education and teacher professional development. It's extremely varied, so teachers can take courses or degree programs at the National Institute of Education in subject matter and pedagogical knowledge, but a lot of it's school-based, led by school staff developers whom I've worked with and seen. So, and their job is to know where there are problems in the school, for example, with math, etc. You can see workshops, you'll see study groups, you'll see lesson study, you'll see peer instruction, you'll see online courses. You will see it all in terms of professional development in Singapore. It is valued. Professional development is really valued. A lot of countries talk the talk. Singapore walks the walk. They make sure that everybody has professional development, especially the people who are doing it, and they support it financially. They give teachers time during their year and during the day to do professional development. But the Ministry of Education has scholarships for teachers to study abroad. Schools have scholarships for teachers to study abroad, to take courses. EDC has hosted Singaporean teachers who have come to learn about education in the United States. And the Singaporean Teachers Network is really this extensive network of teachers that provides conferences and forums and teacher and professional development for one another. So I think the big lesson from Singapore is that if you really want to build human and social capital of a school, then quality professional development matters. So in a lot of places, the attitude is that any professional development is better than none. But in Singapore, it's about the quality of professional development. So for example, in the United States, professional development is a $4 to $18 billion a year industry, and around the globe, professional development is a series of workshops, which are great for awareness, but they're not really great for deep learning. And around the globe, you'll have people who've never taught, and they're teaching teachers how to do something. None of this happens in Singapore. Those who do it or lead it, they're skilled, they're trained, there's a tremendous variety of professional development. The Singaporeans aren't importing models of professional development. They're actually exporting their own models of professional development. And they're really focused on this kind of continuous improvement cycle in schools. So I've shared 7 lessons from these 6 locations. And now I'm going to throw you a final curve with lesson number 8. And lesson number 8 is that there's always an exception to everything I've just said. And this exception is the Netherlands, of course, if you know the Netherlands. So some people will actually argue that the Netherlands has the best education system in Europe. And certainly it has one of the best in Europe. And it's certainly in the top 20 in all 3 areas of the PISA, although that is slipping, reading, math, and science. So in the Netherlands, teaching certificates and licenses are issued by institutes of higher education covering teacher courses, just like every other place. Your teacher has to be university education. And like Japan, the Netherlands has a very centralized system, centralized education system, but it gives almost complete freedom to schools. And unlike Japan or Shanghai or any of our examples, there's no compulsory in-service education or professional development in the Netherlands. So professional development of the teacher during his or her career is actually the responsibility of either the school or the teacher. There are no incentives. There is a broad system of professional development providers. So this is opposite to the Singapore model, where only a few people can do PD. In the Netherlands, it's very open who can provide professional development. But it's completely voluntary, and it is not incentivized. So it's interesting because Dutch teachers have lower rates of participation in formal PD than most of their OECD colleagues. But they participate in more informal PD than most of their OECD colleagues. They're more collaborative than their OECD counterparts. They're actually quite happy teaching. It's an aging workforce, and there are teacher shortages in the Netherlands. The Netherlands does well in the PISA. It's in the top 20, but their rankings are dropped. But the Dutch do so much better than their European counterparts in educating poor immigrant children, of which there are many in the Netherlands. So the Netherlands is an interesting case because it's very high trust and it's very laissez-faire, and the models that we've seen earlier are not. Certainly when it comes to adult behavior, the Netherlands is a very high trust society. So it really violates a lot of the lessons that we've discussed here. It's not super rigorous. It's not mandating professional development. There are no incentives. But generally, the Netherlands has very, very good teaching from what I've seen. This is a classroom that I visited. and a really good education system. But there are threats to that system, and the Dutch have recently introduced a teacher program that works on trying to consolidate requirements for professional development, but it's either not taking effect yet or not due to take effect in 2020, I'm not quite sure. So I'll conclude here. We've looked at several themes or several lessons, and I'll just conclude with a few themes here. And one is that, as we see from our case examples, it really takes a system. We cannot improve teacher quality by professional development alone. We have to address the entire system around teachers, around retention, around pay, around promotion, and then professional development has to be part of that system. We have to have a growth mindset toward good teaching. I work a lot in places where sometimes people throw up their hands and kind of think like, well, good teachers they're kind of static. It's a fixed mindset. They're either good or they're not. But in fact, good teaching can be developed and nurtured, and this is certainly what Shanghai shows us. The third theme, I'd say, from all these places is professional development is about improving student learning. That's it. That's the focus. That's what it always has to be. And a fourth theme I'd say that I see from all of these places is teachers are learners. That if we want to improve our professional development systems, we really have to see teachers as learners as we do students and make the same kind of learning accommodations for teachers that we make for students. The fifth theme really is this idea of continuous professional learning, having and integrating high quality pre-service and in-service programs through induction and mentoring so that the teacher is learning from the very beginning of his or her career to the very end. And finally, and I think this is what the lesson that Japan has given all of us, is that collaboration is key. As John Hattie says, that if you want students to succeed, you let their teachers collaborate. So we have to support, any professional development system has to support teachers in conducting classroom-based individual or collaborative research planning, basically allowing teachers and encouraging teachers to work together. So I will conclude here by thanking you and certainly saying gracias. I see a lot of, I think, Spanish speakers here. This is my email address if you have any questions for me. And I oftentimes post about teacher quality on my Twitter account, so if you're interested in that, feel free to follow or reach out, and I will take any comments or questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mary, for this excellent presentation and for giving us this insight on teacher professional development across the world. At this point, as you were saying, we open the floor for questions or comments by our participants. I know you have already touched on this, and just to start the conversation and the dialogue here, you gave us a lot of different examples from your own experience. And of course, these countries have different socio-economic, political backgrounds. So you can also see like the differences between these systems. Mm-hmm. Since we work mostly with Latin American, Caribbean countries, could you please give some advice on how policymakers, teachers, and the different actors of the education community can contribute to the development of this teacher professional opportunities in their countries from your own experience?
I'll say I began my teaching career actually in the Caribbean and Jamaica, and I've managed to go back since. I will say, having been a teacher for so many years and working with teachers, that one of the things that is often missing from teacher policy is the voice of teachers. It's really hard to make and enforce policies unless you have teacher buy-in, and that's done better in some places than others. It's probably done better in East Asia than anywhere else, but those are kind of group-based cultures. So I would say number one is really to get the voice of teachers. I think sometimes policymakers are terrified to go near teachers, especially teacher unions. Boston is a perfect example of a union working with the city, the school district, to actually improve teaching. It hasn't been easy, but it's happened. So involving teachers, Mexico is another perfect example of that. I mean, the Mexican Teachers Union was a force of kind of considered a force of evil when I was there, and now it's working with the Mexican Ministry of Education on teaching reform. So that would be one. And I would say this is the next thing that Japanese have taught us. I'm a huge admirer of the Japanese education system because they don't do oftentimes don't do any of the best practice, but they have an extraordinary education system. I mean, the Japanese, the Singaporeans as well in Shanghai, probably every place, is grab great ideas wherever you can and from whomever you can. I mean, Japan built really a top world-class education system before the war by doing study groups all over the world, by sending delegations to study not just education, but how to run cities, engineering, et cetera, et cetera. The Singaporeans have done that. I think those are probably the two key areas. And to know that all of this takes time, it takes decades. And for Caribbean countries or Latin American countries, sometimes there's donor funding involved. And that's where the pressure starts because donor-funded agencies, unfortunately, have a lot of political pressure. So they want things done fast, quick, and cheap. Quick, cheap, and easy, I say. And none of this, reforming the quality of your social and human capital at school, none of that is quick or cheap or easy. So we don't have any of I was hoping we'd have some of our Georgian colleagues on here so that they might add to anything I'm saying. Jennifer, I think we have a question. I need my glasses to read this very small chat. Yeah, can you give examples of how to change the system of professional development to teachers? So this obviously is a funding issue. We are extraordinarily reliant, I'm speaking very broadly, on the workshop model. So it's a one-to-many model. It's oftentimes a transmission model as much as we have tried to make it more interactive, et cetera. It's certainly the professional development that I do most of. But I think it's a question of sitting down and really mapping what a place needs. So a workshop's great if you're exposing people to a new idea like ICT. But when it comes time to implement professional development, what you've learned in a workshop, then you need other kinds of professional development models. So study groups to help teachers understand what's a learner-centered approach and how do I do it. These open classrooms, I use these a lot I've designed for a project EDC has in Southeast Asia. I've been doing this for years. In every project that I'm involved that is teacher professional development, I just write in teachers visiting other teachers' classrooms because that is with some kind of a protocol, which I'd be happy to share, because that is really where teachers learn. They learn from each other. They learn from seeing each other. I think peer observations and peer work is good. It's tricky sometimes if you're in a really low resource environment. I've worked in places where the teaching quality is so poor, like in a post-conflict situation. So it doesn't help to have two people who aren't really know what they're doing. I hate to say that, that sounds kind of patriarchal. It sounds very patriarchal. But you really need kind of a facilitator to bring both folks up to another level. So I think looking at what are our goals, what is it we're trying to do, what do we want teachers to be able to do, and then knowing that there exists things besides workshops. There are online courses, there are seminars, there are peer observation feedback, there are open classrooms, there's a lesson study approach. There's all kinds of models for professional development that are far more effective than a simple workshop model. So I hope I've answered the question.
Yes, thank you, Mary. There's another question here by Nicolette Edwards. Yes.
Learning institutions. Sure. Nicola, what can teacher learning institutions do to aid in service? I'll start to answer that, and maybe you can fill me in a little more. I think one is maybe closer links between pre-service institutions and teacher professional development. So, people talk a lot about professional development schools, where you're in an in-service program, you're studying to be a teacher, and you go to a school, and there's this relationship between there's a professional relationship between the school and the in-service institution. So there's kind of a reciprocity there. I think that's one. I think, I'm not sure. I don't want to speak in generalities, but one of the things I think is really, really important is that we have to make sure in many parts of the globe that the people who are preparing teachers actually know how to teach versus lecture. So I've seen that as a challenge in a lot of places in the world. I think really improving the quality of people who do in-service education for teachers, I think, is extremely important. I think all of us, myself included, I've been saying this for years, any of us who do professional development or work with teachers, we have to go back into classrooms. We have to do this on a regular basis, like, for a year or 2 years. I think we should actually be shadowing teachers and working with them so that we're actually learning from them and burnishing our own skills. Let's see, have I answered some of your questions?
Yes, Mary, there's another question by Bernetta Lesporis. What are some strategies to lessen the costs associated with professional development?
Okay. Well, a lot of it is to do it locally. And you see a real movement of that in the United States and a lot of places. Is not bring in the expensive outsider such as me, because that involves, per diems and plane tickets, et cetera, transportation, but really building professional development within your own school, having teacher leaders, kind of coaching people. I'm a huge believer in teacher coaching. I was a school-based coach for many years. I've designed coaching programs. People always say, oh, it's expensive. And it's far less expensive than the workshop where people go off someplace to study for a week and then go back and never implement what they've done, or go to another country to take a workshop and come back to their country and implement nothing. So there's always upfront costs in building the capacity of people through coursework or time from school to attend something. But I think in the long run, you get a less expensive system of professional development at a school level, and you get people who really understand their school and their students and their context, and you build a kind of leadership and capacity and social capital at a school level, which I think is really, good teaching doesn't happen with one or two good teachers. It happens when there's a critical mass of people and there's spillover effects. So then you begin to see, excuse me, that's my bird clock. People begin to see good practice all around them, and the expectations of good practice and good teaching rise. So let's see. Sorry, I'll just leave my glasses on because instead of taking them on or off. According to your point of view, is action research a useful method to... So Catherine, I haven't seen the end of this. Yeah, in general, is action research a good professional development method? I think so. I haven't done it in a while. We did it in the late 1990s on a regional education laboratory grant that I worked on in Austin, Texas. But yeah, getting teachers to look at a problem, study the problem from different angles, implement things, especially with support, I think is always good. Might be good to have more specifics on this. Anything else?
Thank you, Mary, for answering these questions.
That's a very general answer to your
As we wait for other comments or questions by our participants, I'd like to remind you that you can access the materials used during this webinar learn more about this topic with your peers in the Inter-American Collaboratory on the Teaching Profession Code tab on the link that you see on the screens. We will be uploading the synopsis, the PowerPoint presentation, and also the recording of this webinar there on the Code tab. We will also make available the recording on our YouTube channel at reediten.com. So, Mary, I think we have reached.
I'm thinking. One thing I just realized. Sorry, this is I think for Nicola. So, Nicola, my email address is mburns@edc.org, but I actually have a document on different models of professional development. If you write to me, I'll send it to you. So it's kind of a range of PD models. I think that was you. Whoever asked me that question, I'd be happy to send that off to you. So sorry, Diana, just before I forget.
It's okay, Mary. Thank you so much. So as I was saying, I think we have reached the time for this presentation. Thank you once again, Mary, for joining us in this webinar series. And thank you so much for the participants that were today in the live streaming of this seminar. We hope to see you in the next webinars on teacher professional development. If you'd like to add something else, Mary, this will be the time to do so.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Gracias.
Thank you. So I guess this is it. See you in another webinar on professional development.